On a dusty afternoon in Wyoming, Marcus Sterling stood on his sprawling ranch porch, watching a beaten-down motorcycle sputter up his gravel drive. The rider's leather jacket was patched, his boots worn thin, and his weathered face told stories of countless miles on empty roads. When the stranger asked for water and a meal, Marcus felt that familiar surge of superiority. Here was another drifter, another nobody looking for handouts from those who'd built something real. "Tell you what," Marcus said, gesturing toward the corral where Thunder, his untamed stallion, paced restlessly. "Touch that horse and this entire ranch is yours." The gathered ranch hands chuckled knowingly. Thunder had never allowed a single person near him in 5 years, but what happened next would change everything Marcus thought he knew about worth. Respect and the quiet power that comes from understanding rather than owning. What secret did this mysterious biker carry that could tame the untamable? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stranger stepped off his motorcycle with the careful movements of someone who had learned to read situations before acting. Jake Morrison had been riding these back roads for 3 years now, ever since his discharge from the army, and he had developed an eye for the kind of man who measured worth by the size of his spread, rather than the content of his character. This rancher, with his pressed jeans and spotless boots, had probably never worked a day of honest labor in his life. "Name's Jake," he said simply, extending a calloused hand that Marcus barely touched before pulling away. "I appreciate the hospitality, but I don't make bets I can't keep." The ranch hands gathered closer, drawn by the prospect of entertainment. There was Pete, the graying foreman who had worked this land for 30 years and had seen Thunder arrive as a broken 3-year-old. There was Carlos, barely 19 but already wise to the ways of horses, and old Henry, whose arthritis kept him from the heavy work but whose knowledge of livestock remained unmatched. They had all tried their hand with Thunder at one point or another, and they all bore the scars to prove it. Thunder himself stood in the center of his corral like a monument to wildness. He was a magnificent black stallion, standing 17 hands high, with muscles that rippled beneath his coat like steel cables. His eyes held the kind of wariness that came from betrayal, and his stance spoke of coiled violence ready to explode at the first sign of threat. The corral fence bore the marks of his fury: gouged wood where he had struck with iron-shod hooves, bent rails where he had thrown his weight against the barriers that confined him. Marcus felt his confidence surge as he watched Jake study the horse. This drifter might have an air of quiet competence about him, but Thunder was a force of nature. The stallion had hospitalized 2 professional trainers, sent a rodeo champion to the emergency room with a dislocated shoulder, and made Marcus himself think twice about ever entering that corral again. The horse was beautiful, powerful, and absolutely untouchable. 5 years I've owned that animal," Marcus said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Cost me more than your bike is worth just to get him here. 3 different trainers have tried to break him, and all 3 left with their tails between their legs. Horses never let a human being lay a finger on him." Jake's eyes remained fixed on Thunder, watching the way the stallion moved, the set of his ears, the tension in his powerful frame. There was something familiar in that defensive posture, something that spoke to experiences Jake knew all too well. He had seen that same look in the eyes of soldiers returning from deployment, the same rigid alertness that came from surviving in a world where trust could mean the difference between life and death. "Sometimes the strongest ones are just the most afraid," Jake said quietly, more to himself than to the gathering crowd. Sarah Sterling emerged from the ranch house, drawn by the commotion. At 26, she had her father's strong jaw, but her mother's gentle eyes, and she moved with the purposeful stride of someone who had spent her life around animals. She was 3 years into her veterinary studies, specializing in large animal medicine, and she had written more papers on equine trauma therapy than her professors cared to read. Thunder had been her obsession since the day he arrived. a puzzle she longed to solve, but had never found the key to unlock. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying a note of warning, "maybe this isn't such a good idea." But Marcus was already warming to his theme, enjoying the audience and the certainty of his position. "Son, I've seen cowpokes and horse whisperers and every kind of fool who thinks he knows something about animals. That horse in there isn't just wild, he's damaged. Something happened to him before he came here, something that broke whatever trust he might have had in human beings. You can see it in his eyes if you know what to look for." Jake nodded slowly, understanding more than Marcus realized. "I know what to look for," he said simply. The worn military dog tag beneath Jake's shirt seemed to grow heavier against his chest, carrying with it memories of another time, another place, and another damaged creature who had needed someone to see past the fear to the pain beneath. In Afghanistan, he had worked with the military's equine units, helping to rehabilitate horses traumatized by the sounds and chaos of war. He had learned that healing began not with dominance, but with patience, not with force, but with understanding. Thunder raised his head as if sensing the weight of attention focused on him, his nostrils flaring as he tested the wind for threats. His dark eyes swept the gathering crowd with the practiced wariness of a creature who had learned that humans brought nothing but pain and disappointment. But when his gaze lingered on Jake, something shifted almost imperceptibly, a momentary softening in the rigid line of his neck, a barely perceptible relaxation in the set of his ears. Jake felt that familiar tightening in his chest, the recognition that came from seeing his own story reflected in another's suffering. He had come here looking for nothing more than a meal and some water for his journey. But now he found himself facing something he had not expected, a chance to heal not just his own wounds, but those of a creature whose pain he understood all too well. Thunder's story began 5 years ago when Marcus Sterling decided that owning a magnificent stallion would add to his reputation as a serious rancher. The horse had come from a rescue operation in Colorado, one of those heartbreaking cases where investigators found dozens of animals in various states of neglect and abuse. The previous owner had tried to break Thunder using methods that belonged in a darker century: starvation, isolation, and violence designed to crush the animal's spirit into submission. Sarah remembered the day Thunder arrived, transported in a trailer that bore the scars of his fury. He had emerged like a dark storm, all flying hooves and bared teeth, his coat dull from poor nutrition, and his eyes holding a wildness that spoke of desperation rather than strength. The veterinary records told a story of systematic cruelty, rope burns around his neck, scarring on his flanks from spurs and whips, and a profound psychological trauma that had turned a naturally social animal into a creature that viewed every human approach as a prelude to pain. First trainer lasted 2 weeks, Pete said, settling into the rhythm of a story told many times. Fellow from Montana, claimed he'd never met a horse he couldn't gentle. Thunder put him in the hospital on day 10, kicked him so hard it cracked 3 ribs and gave him a concussion that kept him seeing double for a month. Carlos nodded, remembering his own early attempts to befriend the stallion. I tried bringing him apples, he said. Thought maybe if I could get him to associate people with good things, you know. But he wouldn't even let me get close to the fence, just stood there in the middle of the corral, watching me like I was some kind of predator. The second trainer had been a woman from California who specialized in what she called trauma-informed equine therapy. She had lasted 3 weeks, longer than most, but ultimately left in frustration when Thunder refused to engage with any of her carefully designed protocols. The third had been a cowboy from Texas with 40 years of experience and a reputation for handling the most difficult horses. Thunder had sent him home after just 5 days, not through violence, but through something worse, complete and utter indifference, as if the man simply didn't exist. Jake studied the veterinary files that Sarah quietly produced from her truck, his experienced eye reading between the lines of clinical language to understand the full scope of Thunder's trauma. The horse's medical history painted a picture of systematic abuse that had gone on for years before his rescue. The physical wounds had healed, but the psychological scars ran deep, creating defensive patterns that had become as much a part of Thunder as his black coat and powerful frame. "Look at how he positions himself," Jake said, drawing the group's attention to Thunder's stance in the corral. Always with his back to the corner, maximum sightlines in all directions. He's not just being defensive, he's displaying classic hypervigilance. Every muscle in his body is coiled for immediate fight-or-flight response. Marcus frowned, unused to having his possessions analyzed with such clinical precision. "Horse is crazy, that's all. Some animals just can't be helped. I keep him because he's worth a fortune as breeding stock, assuming we could ever get close enough to collect genetic material." But Sarah was listening to Jake with growing fascination, recognizing in his words the kind of insight she had been searching for in her veterinary studies. "You've seen this before," she said. It wasn't a question. Jake nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Thunder. "In war zones, you see a lot of animals that have been through hell. Dogs, horses, even livestock. They develop survival mechanisms that serve them well in dangerous situations, but become obstacles to healing once they're safe. The challenge isn't breaking those mechanisms, it's teaching them that they're no longer necessary." Thunder seemed to sense the quality of attention being directed toward him, and he began to pace with increased agitation. His hooves struck the ground in a rhythm that spoke of barely contained energy, and his head tossed with each step as if he were fighting invisible restraints. The halter that hung unused on a nearby post seemed to mock the very idea that such a creature could ever accept human guidance. "Problem is," Marcus said, his confidence returning as he watched Thunder's display of wildness, "everyone who's tried to help that animal has left here convinced he's beyond saving. Vets, trainers, even Sarah with all her book learning. Sometimes you just have to accept that some things can't be fixed." But Jake was seeing something different in Thunder's movement, reading the subtle language of equine body mechanics that most people missed. The pacing wasn't random. It followed a specific pattern, always returning to the same corner, always maintaining the same distance from the fence. The head tossing wasn't simple agitation, but a ritualized behavior that served to release tension while maintaining alertness. "He's not broken," Jake said quietly. "He's adapted. There's a difference." Henry, who had been silent through most of the conversation, finally spoke up. "In my day, we would have put a horse like that down rather than let him suffer. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is accept when something's beyond help." Jake turned to look at the old cowboy, and for a moment, his calm facade cracked enough to reveal the depth of experience behind his words. "In my day," he said softly, "I learned that sometimes the ones who seem beyond help just need someone who speaks their language." The sun was beginning to lower in the western sky, casting long shadows across the corral and painting Thunder's black coat with highlights of gold and bronze. In that light, the stallion looked less like a monument to wildness and more like what he truly was, a magnificent animal whose capacity for trust had been shattered but not destroyed, waiting for someone with the patience and understanding to help him find his way back to connection. Jake reached into his worn leather jacket and pulled out a faded photograph, its edges soft from years of handling. The image showed a younger version of himself in military fatigues, standing beside a bay mare whose eyes held the same wariness that now shone in Thunder's gaze. Behind them, the dusty landscape of Afghanistan stretched to distant mountains, and in the background, other soldiers worked with horses that had been rescued from the chaos of war. Her name was Sahara, Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of memory. Found her in a bombed-out village outside Kandahar, half-starved and terrified of every shadow. The local militias had been using horses to transport supplies through terrain too rough for vehicles. And when the fighting got bad, they just abandoned them to fend for themselves. Sarah moved closer to see the photograph, drawn by the gentleness in Jake's expression as he remembered. In the image, Sahara stood with her head lowered, accepting Jake's touch, but still alert, still ready to flee. It was the posture of an animal learning to trust again, one careful step at a time. Military had a program, Jake continued, rehabilitating animals traumatized by combat. Turns out horses that have been through hell understand soldiers who have been through hell. They could help each other heal in ways that no amount of therapy or medication seemed to manage. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, unused to conversations that delved beneath the surface of things. "That's all very touching," he said, "but Thunder isn't some war horse. He's a luxury item that I bought to improve my breeding program. The fact that he's unmanageable doesn't change his bloodlines or his value." But Jake was watching Thunder with the kind of focused attention that came from understanding, and he could see the subtle signs that others missed. The way Thunder's ears flickered when Jake spoke, the slight shift in his stance when Jake moved closer to the fence, the momentary pause in his pacing when their eyes met across the distance of the corral. "Trauma doesn't care about bloodlines," Jake said quietly. "A nervous system that's been overwhelmed by fear and violence responds the same way, whether it belongs to a $2,000 rescue horse or a $50,000 stallion. The healing process is the same too. It requires patience, consistency, and someone who understands that trust can't be forced." Pete, who had been listening with growing interest, finally spoke up. "You really think you can reach him? Because I've been working with horses for 30 years, and I've never seen one as shut down as Thunder. It's like he's built a wall around himself that nothing can penetrate." Jake nodded, understanding the foreman's skepticism. "The wall isn't keeping people out," he said. "It's keeping him safe. In his mind, that barrier is the only thing standing between him and more pain. The trick isn't breaking down the wall. It's teaching him that he doesn't need it anymore." Sarah found herself studying Jake with new appreciation, recognizing in his words the kind of insight that her veterinary textbooks could only hint at. She had read extensively about equine trauma therapy, written papers on the subject, even attended seminars given by respected experts in the field. But there was something different about hearing it from someone who had actually lived it, who spoke from experience rather than theory. "The breathing is the key," Jake continued, his eyes still fixed on Thunder. "Watch how he breathes, shallow, rapid, never fully relaxing even when he's standing still. His entire nervous system is locked in a state of hyper-arousal. Every sense is heightened, every muscle ready for immediate action. It's exhausting, but it's also the only way he knows how to survive." As if responding to Jake's words, Thunder suddenly stopped his pacing and stood perfectly still in the center of the corral. For a moment, the only sound was the whisper of wind through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle in far pastures. Then Thunder raised his head and looked directly at Jake, and in that gaze was something that made Sarah catch her breath, not the blank hostility she had grown accustomed to, but a flicker of curiosity. As if the stallion sensed something different about this particular human. "He's listening," Sarah whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. Jake pulled off his leather jacket and set it aside, revealing arms marked with the kind of scars that came from years of working with damaged animals and damaged people. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, each gesture telegraphed clearly so that Thunder could read his intentions from across the corral. "In Afghanistan, I learned that healing begins with respect," Jake said, his voice dropping to a tone that seemed to carry across the distance to Thunder's attentive ears. "Not the kind of respect that comes from fear or dominance, but the kind that comes from recognizing that every creature, human or animal, deserves to have their pain acknowledged and their courage honored." Marcus felt a strange uneasiness growing in his chest, a sense that this conversation was moving beyond the simple bet he had proposed and into territory that made him uncomfortable. He had intended to humiliate this drifter, to demonstrate his own superiority and send the man on his way with a lesson about knowing his place. But something about Jake's quiet confidence and the way Thunder was responding to his presence suggested that Marcus might have misjudged the situation entirely. Time's wasting, Marcus said, trying to regain control of the narrative. Sun's going down, and I've got other things to do. You going to try this fool stunt or not? Jake folded the photograph carefully and tucked it back into his shirt pocket, right next to the dog tag that rested against his heart. Then he looked at Thunder one more time, reading the subtle signs of the stallion's body language, assessing the level of tension, the quality of attention, the depth of the fear that still shadowed those dark eyes. I'm going to try, he said simply, but not because of your bet. I'm going to try because that horse deserves to know that not all humans bring pain. And with that, Jake Morrison began walking toward the corral gate, his worn combat boots raising small clouds of dust with each measured step. The moment Jake's hand touched the gate latch, Thunder exploded into motion. The stallion reared back on his hind legs, his front hooves pawing the air as he released a sound that was part whinny, part scream of rage. His massive frame twisted with surprising agility as he spun away from the gate, kicking out with both rear hooves in a display of violence that sent the gathered spectators stumbling backward from the fence. Jesus, Carlos breathed, crossing himself instinctively. I forgot how big he really is when he gets riled up. Thunder's hooves struck the ground with the force of sledgehammers, each impact sending vibrations through the earth that could be felt through the soles of everyone's boots. He charged toward the far end of the corral, then wheeled around and charged back, his eyes rolling white with panic and fury. The wooden fence posts creaked under the pressure as he threw his weight against the rails, testing the barriers that contained him with the desperate energy of a creature that had learned to associate human presence with suffering. Jake stood perfectly still at the gate, his hand still resting on the latch, but making no move to open it. His breathing remained steady and deep, his posture relaxed, despite the thunderous display of aggression just yards away. He had seen this response before, in horses and humans alike, the explosive reaction that came when traumatized creatures felt their last refugees being threatened. Maybe we should call this off, Sarah said, her veterinary training warring with her fascination. He's more agitated than I've seen him in months, but Jake was reading the situation with the practiced eye of someone who understood that healing rarely looked peaceful in its early stages. Thunder's rage was genuine, but beneath it was something else, a desperate attempt to communicate, to establish boundaries, to make it clear that he would not submit to another round of abuse without a fight. He's not angry, Jake said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of Thunder's hooves. He's terrified. This is what panic looks like when you're strong enough to fight back. Marcus felt his confidence returning as he watched Thunder's violent display. No man in his right mind would enter that corral with a half-ton of furious horseflesh looking for something to destroy. The bet was as good as won, and this drifter would leave here with a lesson about overestimating his own abilities. Still think you can gentle him with some soft words and good intentions. Marcus called out, having to raise his voice to be heard over Thunder's continued rampage. Jake finally opened the gate, the hinges protesting with a rusty squeal that seemed to freeze Thunder in mid-charge. The stallion skidded to a halt, his attention fixed on this human who had dared to breach the sanctity of his domain. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, horse and man regarded each other across the dusty expanse of the corral. Then Jake stepped inside and closed the gate behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place seemed to galvanize Thunder into even greater fury. He reared again, this time higher than before, his hooves slashing the air mere feet from where Jake stood. The power in that display was breathtaking, muscles bunched like coiled springs, tendons standing out like cables beneath his gleaming coat, every line of his body speaking of barely contained violence. Jake stood his ground, but he made no aggressive moves, no sudden gestures that might trigger an even more violent response. Instead, he began to breathe with deliberate intention, drawing air deep into his lungs and releasing it in slow, measured exhalations. It was a technique he had learned not in any horse training manual, but in the quiet moments between firefights, when staying calm meant the difference between life and death. Thunder landed hard, all four hooves striking the ground simultaneously with a sound like thunder. He immediately spun and kicked out with his rear legs, the iron shoes on his hooves whistling through the air where a less experienced person might have been standing. But Jake had positioned himself carefully, reading the horse's movement patterns, understanding the geometry of equine aggression well enough to stay within striking distance while remaining outside the zones of greatest danger. "He's going to kill him," Pete muttered, his weathered hands gripping the fence rail so tightly his knuckles showed white. But Jake was beginning to see patterns in Thunder's seemingly random violence. The stallion's charges always stopped short of actual contact. His kicks were aimed to intimidate rather than connect. And beneath the fury was an unmistakable wariness, as if Thunder was testing this strange human who refused to either flee or attack. "Easy, son," Jake said, his voice cutting through Thunder's agitation with the kind of calm authority that came from years of dealing with creatures pushed beyond their limits. "Nobody's here to hurt you. Nobody's going to force you to do anything you don't want to do." Thunder's ears flickered at the sound of Jake's voice, and for just a moment his wild circling slowed. It was a tiny crack in the wall of his rage, but it was enough to give Jake hope that somewhere, beneath all that pain and fury, was the horse that Thunder had been before the world taught him to fight for his survival. The late afternoon sun slanted through the dust kicked up by Thunder's hooves, creating columns of golden light that danced between horse and man. In that ethereal illumination, it was possible to see this moment for what it truly was, not a contest between dominance and submission, but the first tentative steps in a dance as old as the relationship between humans and horses. A dance that could only succeed when both partners chose to participate rather than being forced to perform. Jake reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a worn silver pocket watch, his grandfather's timepiece that had ticked steadily through 2 wars and 40 years of ranching in Montana. The watch had taught him that some things couldn't be rushed, that the most important victories were measured not in minutes, but in moments of connection, built one careful breath at a time. Thunder had slowed his frantic pacing, but remained coiled with tension, his dark eyes tracking Jake's every movement. The stallion's nostrils flared with each breath, reading the air for signs of threat or deception. His ears swiveled constantly, monitoring not just Jake, but the crowd gathered beyond the fence, the shifting wind, the distant sounds of the ranch settling into evening routines. "Time means different things to different creatures," Jake said, his voice pitched low enough that only Thunder could hear clearly. "To you, every second feels like a lifetime when you're waiting for the next betrayal. To me, time is just the space between heartbeats, and I've got all the heartbeats in the world." The watching crowd had fallen silent, drawn into the strange theater playing out before them. Even Marcus found himself leaning forward, his certainty beginning to waver as he watched this stranger demonstrate a patience that bordered on the supernatural. Most men would have either fled in terror or tried to assert dominance through force by now. Jake simply stood there, breathing steadily, letting Thunder set the pace of their interaction. Thunder's pacing gradually shifted from frantic circles to a more deliberate pattern. He would approach to within 15 feet of Jake, then veer away, testing the boundaries of this strange human's reaction. Each pass brought him incrementally closer, his curiosity beginning to overcome his fear as Jake continued to do absolutely nothing threatening. "Look at his breathing," Sarah whispered to Pete, her veterinary training helping her read the subtle changes in Thunder's physiology. "It's starting to slow down. His panic response is beginning to ease." Pete nodded, recognizing the signs, even if he didn't understand the science behind them. "Her horse is starting to think instead of just react," he agreed. "Haven't seen that in years." Jake could feel the shift, too, the way Thunder's energy was beginning to transform from explosive violence to cautious investigation. The stallion's head was no longer held in the rigid alertness of fight-or-flight response, but had begun to lower slightly. allowing him to use his exceptional sense of smell to gather information about this puzzling human. "Horses are conversation animals," Jake said, still speaking to Thunder rather than the audience. "In the wild, they spend their days talking to each other through body language, sharing information about safety and danger, food and water, comfort and discomfort. But you haven't had a real conversation with a human in so long. You've forgotten how to speak the language." Thunder paused in his pacing, his attention fully focused on Jake for the first time since the man had entered the corral. Something in Jake's tone, in the rhythm of his breathing, in the deliberate stillness of his posture, was beginning to penetrate the walls Thunder had built around his traumatized psyche. "The thing about conversations," Jake continued, "is that they require two willing participants. I can stand here and talk all day, but until you decide you want to listen, we're just making noise at each other." Marcus checked his own watch, noting that nearly 20 minutes had passed since Jake entered the corral. The sun was sinking lower toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange that reflected off Thunder's black coat like fire on water. In that light, with the dust settling around them, man and horse looked less like adversaries and more like two souls engaged in an ancient ritual of recognition. Thunder took a single step closer to Jake, then stopped, his entire body tense with the effort of overcoming instincts that screamed at him to maintain distance. It was the smallest of gestures, but to those who understood horses, it represented a monumental victory, the first conscious choice Thunder had made in years to move toward a human rather than away. Jake felt the significance of that single step settle into his bones like a prayer answered. He had seen this moment before, in other damaged creatures in other places, the instant when survival instinct began to give way to the deeper need for connection that lived at the heart of every social animal. "There you are," he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to wrap around Thunder like a gentle hand. "I wondered when you were going to decide to join this conversation." The memories came flooding back as Jake watched Thunder's tentative approach, carrying him across continents and years to a forward operating base outside Kabul, where the air tasted of dust and diesel fuel, and where damaged creatures of all kinds learned to trust again or died trying. He remembered a grey mare named Phantom, so traumatized by rocket attacks that she would collapse in terror at the sound of a helicopter. He remembered a young gelding called Ranger, rescued from a Taliban supply route, who had learned to associate human voices with the crack of whips and the burn of electric prods. But most of all, he remembered the patience required to undo damage that had been inflicted with such deliberate cruelty. Each horse had been a puzzle, a unique combination of specific traumas and individual personality that required its own approach, its own timeline, its own carefully calibrated balance of pressure and release. Thunder's scarred halter post stood like a monument to frustrated violence at the far end of the corral, its wood gouged and splintered from years of the stallion's attempts to break free from anything that resembled restraint. Jake could read the story written in those scars, the desperate thrashing of an animal that had learned to associate rope and leather with pain and domination, the gradual wearing away of wood that spoke of countless hours spent fighting against captivity. "Trauma doesn't just change behavior," Jake said, his words carrying across the corral to Thunder's attentive ears. "It rewrites the entire nervous system, changes the way information gets processed, alters the fundamental relationship between mind and body. What looks like stubbornness or aggression is usually just a survival mechanism that's gotten stuck in the on position." Sarah found herself completely absorbed in Jake's explanation, recognizing concepts from her advanced coursework in animal psychology, but hearing them explained with the authority of lived experience. She had read about trauma-informed therapy in textbooks, but watching it unfold in real time was something altogether different. Marcus, meanwhile, was experiencing a growing unease that had nothing to do with Thunder's behavior and everything to do with his own increasing awareness that this situation was spiraling beyond his control. He had intended a simple humiliation, a way to put this drifter in his place and send him on his way. Instead, he found himself watching something that felt uncomfortably like a revelation, a demonstration of wisdom and competence that made his own limitations impossible to ignore. The ranch itself seemed to hold its breath as Thunder took another cautious step toward Jake, then another. The stallion's movements were careful, deliberate, each placement of his hooves a conscious decision rather than an automatic response. His head remained high, alert for any sign of threat, but his ears had shifted from the flat-back position of aggression to the forward-pricked attention of genuine curiosity. In Afghanistan, Jake continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a story told to calm both speaker and listener. We had a saying, every horse remembers every hand that has touched him. The good news is that horses also have an infinite capacity for updating their information when presented with new evidence. Pete shifted his weight against the fence rail, his weathered face creased with concentration as he tried to understand what he was witnessing. In 30 years of working with livestock, he had never seen anything quite like this. A man, standing perfectly still while a half-ton of traumatized horseflesh gradually chose to approach. Rather than flee, Thunder paused when he reached a distance of about 10 feet from Jake, close enough that the stallion's superior senses could gather detailed information about this strange human scent. His breathing patterns, the subtle chemical signals that revealed emotional state and intention. For several long minutes, they simply regarded each other across that small but significant distance. The hardest part about working with traumatized animals, Jake said, isn't teaching them to trust again. It's learning to be worthy of that trust. Every movement, every breath, every heartbeat has to communicate the same message. I see your pain, I respect your fear, and I will never use your vulnerability against you. Thunder's nostrils flared as he processed Jake's scent, reading the complex chemical signature that revealed more than words ever could. There was no smell of fear, no adrenaline sharp tang of aggression, no underlying current of deception or violence. Instead, there was something that Thunder's traumatized psyche had almost forgotten existed, the calm, steady presence of a creature that posed no threat. The stallion lowered his head slightly, a gesture that in equine body language represented the beginning of submission, not to dominance, but to curiosity. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible to untrained eyes. But to Jake it represented a breakthrough as significant as any he had achieved in the mountains of Afghanistan. "Easy, son," Jake murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Take all the time you need. We're not going anywhere." And in that moment, as Thunder took another small step closer, the wooden halter post seemed less like a monument to violence, and more like a reminder of how far both horse and man had traveled from the places where their pain had been born. Jake reached slowly into his back pocket and withdrew a well-worn field manual. Its pages soft from years of handling, and its cover faded from exposure to sun and weather. The title, barely visible through the accumulated wear, read Field Guide to Animal Psychology in Combat Zones, and its margins were filled with handwritten notes in Jake's careful script. This book had been his constant companion through 3 deployments, a practical guide to understanding and healing creatures that had been pushed beyond their natural limits. "The first thing you learn about traumatized animals," Jake said, opening the manual to a page marked with a strip of leather, "is that they never forget the feeling of being powerless. Every interaction becomes a test. Is this human going to respect my boundaries, or am I going to have to fight for my survival again?" Thunder had closed the distance to approximately 8 feet now, near enough that Jake could see the fine details of the stallion's scarred hide, the small marks left by years of poor treatment that told their own story of systematic abuse. But more importantly, Jake could see the subtle changes in Thunder's posture that indicated a fundamental shift in the horse's internal state. the slight relaxation in his neck muscles, the softening around his eyes, the way his breathing had deepened from the shallow, panting of panic to something approaching normal respiration. Sarah watched in fascination as Jake began to demonstrate the specific calming techniques described in his manual. His breathing became even more deliberate, following a pattern that seemed designed to communicate safety through rhythm alone. His posture shifted subtly, angling his body slightly away from Thunder to reduce the visual impression of direct confrontation, while still maintaining respectful attention. Respiratory entrainment, Jake explained, noticing Sarah's interest. Horses are incredibly sensitive to the breathing patterns of other creatures. When they encounter a human whose breathing is calm and steady, their own nervous systems begin to synchronize with that rhythm. It's one of the most powerful tools we have for communicating safety without words. Marcus found himself checking his watch again, noting that nearly 45 minutes had passed since Jake entered the corral. The sun was now touching the horizon, painting the entire scene in shades of gold and crimson that made Thunder's black coat seem to glow with inner fire. What had begun as a simple bet was transforming into something that made Marcus increasingly uncomfortable, a demonstration of knowledge and skill that highlighted his own ignorance about the animal he claimed to own. Thunder's ears had shifted to a position Jake recognized from his work with other traumatized horses, not the flat-back aggression of fight-or-flight response, nor the rigid alertness of hypervigilance, but the forward-tilted attention of a creature that was beginning to engage with rather than simply endure its environment. It was a subtle change, but one that represented hours of progress compressed into minutes of genuine connection. The manual calls it voluntary proximity. Jake said, turning another page to show Sarah a diagram of equine body language. It's the first sign that an animal is choosing to engage, rather than simply submitting to circumstances beyond its control. See how his head position has changed? He's not watching me like a predator anymore. He's studying me like a puzzle he wants to solve. Pete found himself nodding in recognition, his decades of experience with horses allowing him to see what Jake was describing. Never thought about it that way, he admitted, but you're right. Usually when Thunder looks at people, it's like he's calculating how much damage he can do before we hurt him. This is different. Thunder took another step closer, bringing him to within 6 feet of Jake, close enough that the man could have reached out and touched the stallion's muzzle if he had chosen to do so. But Jake remained perfectly still, understanding that this moment belonged to Thunder, that any attempt to rush or force the connection would shatter the fragile trust they were building together. "The hardest lesson I learned in Afghanistan," Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, was that healing trauma isn't about making the fear go away. It's about creating new experiences that are stronger than the old pain. You can't erase what happened to an animal like Thunder, but you can give him enough positive interactions to outnumber the negative ones. Thunder's breathing had synchronized completely with Jake's now, the two creatures sharing a rhythm that seemed to create a pocket of calm in the center of the dusty corral. The stallion's eyes, which had blazed with fear and fury just an hour before, now held something that Sarah almost didn't dare to name, hope, tentative and fragile, but unmistakably present. Jake closed the field manual and slipped it back into his pocket, his movement slow and deliberate so as not to startle Thunder from this delicate state of trust. The stallion tracked the motion with his eyes but didn't retreat. Another small but significant victory in their ongoing conversation. "The moment is coming," Jake said quietly, speaking as much to himself as to the watching crowd. "The moment when he decides whether to trust or flee. And when it comes, everything will depend on whether I'm worthy of the choice he's about to make." Thunder's silver feeding bowl sat untouched in the corner of the corral, a gleaming reminder of the stallion's rejection of every attempt at kindness over the past 5 years. Marcus had spent a fortune on that bowl, commissioning it from a silversmith in Denver who specialized in custom tack for wealthy horse owners. It was engraved with Thunder's name and bloodline, a monument to expensive futility that had never held so much as a handful of oats because Thunder refused to eat anything offered by human hands. "He hasn't eaten from that bowl once," Sarah said quietly, following Jake's gaze to the untouched silver. "We have to scatter his feed on the ground and leave the corral before he'll touch it. Even his water has to be delivered when he's not looking." Jake nodded, understanding the deeper significance of Thunder's rejection. Food was trust in its most basic form, the willingness to be vulnerable while consuming sustenance that could be poisoned, drugged, or used as bait for capture. A horse that refused human-offered food was a horse that had learned through bitter experience that survival meant rejecting even the most basic gestures of care. "Tell me about the first day he arrived," Jake said, still maintaining his position as Thunder continued to study him from just a few feet away. Pete shifted against the fence, his memory reaching back to that chaotic morning 5 years ago. "Truck pulled up about dawn," he recalled. "Driver was nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Said Thunder had kicked a hole in the side of the trailer during transport, and they were lucky to get here with all their fingers." Sarah picked up the story, her voice soft with remembered sadness. "When they opened the trailer, he just stood there for the longest time, like he couldn't believe the truck had actually stopped. Then he exploded out of there like he was shot from a cannon, ran straight to the farthest corner of the corral, and hasn't trusted a human being since." Thunder's ears flickered as he listened to the conversation about his past, his dark eyes never leaving Jake's face. There was something in the stallion's expression that suggested he understood more than simple animal instinct should allow, as if he recognized the significance of having his story told by voices that held no anger, no frustration, only a kind of weary sadness for suffering that should never have occurred. "The first meal we offered him," Pete continued, "he knocked the bucket clean out of the corral. Food went everywhere, and he just stood there shaking like he expected us to beat him for making a mess. Broke my heart to see an animal that's scared of simple kindness." Jake felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the recognition that came from understanding exactly what Thunder had endured. He had seen the same response in human soldiers, the way trauma could make even the most basic gestures of care feel like potential threats. The exhausting vigilance required to survive in a world where kindness had too often been followed by betrayal. "Trauma rewrites the entire relationship with nourishment," Jake explained, his voice pitched to include Thunder in the conversation. "When you've been starved as punishment or had your food poisoned to make you compliant, eating becomes an act of courage rather than simple hunger." Thunder took another small step closer, bringing him near enough that Jake could see his own reflection in the stallion's dark eyes. The horse's breathing remained synchronized with Jake's, creating a pocket of shared calm that seemed to insulate them from the watching world beyond the fence. Marcus checked his watch again, noting that the sun was now fully touching the horizon. In another hour, it would be too dark to continue safely, and he found himself hoping that darkness would bring an end to this increasingly uncomfortable demonstration. Nothing about his carefully structured world was supposed to include drifters who possessed knowledge and skills that he lacked, especially knowledge that revealed the depth of his own ignorance about the animal he claimed to own. "The feeding bowl isn't really about food," Jake said, his insight cutting to the heart of Thunder's psychological state. "It's about agency. Every time he rejects what we offer, he's making a choice, exercising the only control he has left. It's not stubbornness, it's survival." Sarah found herself nodding, finally understanding something that had puzzled her for years. "That's why all the trainers failed," she said. "They were trying to break his will instead of helping him rebuild his capacity for choice." Thunder's head lowered slightly, his muzzle now less than 4 feet from Jake's outstretched hand. The stallion's nostrils flared as he processed Jake's scent more deeply, reading the complex chemical signature that revealed emotional state, health, and most importantly, intention. What he found there seemed to satisfy some deep need for reassurance, because for the first time in 5 years, Thunder began to show signs of genuine relaxation. "There it is," Jake whispered, recognizing the moment he had been waiting for. "He's deciding to trust." And in that instant, as Thunder lowered his magnificent head and took the final step that brought him within touching distance, the silver feeding bowl seemed less like a symbol of rejection and more like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The possibility that even the most damaged creatures could learn to accept care when it was offered with genuine respect and understanding. Sarah pulled her veterinary textbook from the truck's cab, its pages marked with countless post-it notes and highlighted passages about equine trauma therapy. She had been studying this subject for 3 years, writing papers that her professors praised for their theoretical sophistication. But until this moment, she had never seen the principles applied with such intuitive mastery. Jake was demonstrating concepts that existed only as abstract ideas in her textbooks, bringing them to life with a practical understanding that could only come from years of real experience. "The proximal zone of engagement," she whispered, finding the relevant passage in her book. "The distance at which a traumatized animal begins to show voluntary approach behaviors rather than defensive positioning." Jake heard her words and nodded slightly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might break the delicate spell of trust that Thunder was weaving around them both. "The textbooks are right about the theory," he said quietly, "but what they can't teach you is how to read the moment when an animal decides to risk vulnerability. It's different for every creature, and it can't be forced or predicted, only recognized when it happens." Thunder was now close enough that Jake could feel the warmth radiating from the stallion's powerful body, could hear the soft whisper of breath through his nostrils, could see the individual whiskers around his muzzle and the long lashes that fringed his dark eyes. The horse's proximity was overwhelming in its significance. 5 years of absolute isolation and mistrust dissolved in the space of an hour through nothing more than patience and genuine understanding. "My God," Pete breathed, his weathered face creased with amazement. "In 30 years, I've never seen anything like this. That horse is actually choosing to be close to a human being." Marcus felt his world tilting on its axis as he watched this impossible scene unfold. Everything he thought he knew about power, about ownership, about the natural order of dominance and submission was being quietly demolished by a drifter whose only tools were patience and respect. The bet that had seemed so certain just hours before now felt like a trap of his own making, a challenge that was revealing his own inadequacies rather than exposing this stranger's presumption. Jake began to speak in the soft, rhythmic tone that he had learned to use with traumatized animals, a cadence that seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to the deeper parts of the brain, where trust and fear battled for supremacy. "Easy, son. Nobody's going to hurt you. Nobody's going to force you to do anything you don't want to do. This is your choice, your decision, your timeline." Thunder's ears were now fully forward, his attention completely focused on Jake with an intensity that spoke of profound concentration. The stallion's breathing had slowed to match Jake's exactly, creating a synchrony that seemed to extend beyond simple respiration to encompass heartbeat, muscle tension, and nervous system arousal. They were achieving what animal behaviorists called co-regulation, the process by which one creature's calm state helps to stabilize another's anxiety. "Look at his eye," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. "The white rim is gone completely. He's not in flight mode anymore. He's fully present, fully engaged." Jake could see it too. The fundamental shift in Thunder's emotional state that transformed him from a creature driven by survival instinct to an animal capable of curiosity and connection. It was a transformation he had witnessed many times before, but it never failed to move him, the moment when a damaged soul decided to risk trust one more time. "The military taught me a lot about trauma," Jake said. His words meant as much for Thunder as for the watching crowd. But the most important lesson came from the animals themselves. They taught me that healing isn't about forgetting the past or pretending the pain never happened. It's about discovering that not all humans are the same, that kindness exists in the world alongside cruelty, and that trust is always a choice, never an obligation. Thunder's muzzle was now less than 18 inches from Jake's outstretched hand, close enough that the stallion could have easily reached out and made contact if he chose to do so. But Jake remained perfectly still, understanding that this final decision belonged entirely to Thunder. Any attempt to close the remaining distance would violate the trust they had been building and potentially shatter the progress they had made. "Take your time," Jake murmured. "I'm not going anywhere. We've got all the time in the world." And in that moment of perfect stillness, with the sun painting the corral in shades of gold and crimson, it seemed as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for a damaged stallion to decide whether to believe one more time in the possibility of human kindness. In his ranch office, hidden beneath a stack of feed bills and veterinary invoices, lay a foreclosure notice that Marcus had been avoiding for 3 weeks. The Sterling Ranch, which had been in his family for 4 generations, was drowning in debt that Marcus had accumulated through a combination of poor decisions, expensive mistakes, and the kind of prideful spending that came from trying to maintain an image he could no longer afford. His father's championship trophy sat on the mantel above his desk, a constant reminder of the legacy Marcus felt he was failing to uphold. The trophy bore the inscription, "Robert Sterling, Wyoming Rodeo Champion 1987, and beneath it, in smaller letters, "A man's worth is measured by his character, not his possessions." Marcus had read those words 1,000 times over the years, but had never truly understood their meaning until this moment, watching a homeless drifter demonstrate the kind of quiet mastery that his father would have recognized and respected. Thunder's bloodline alone is worth more than most people make in a year, Marcus had told the banker just last month, using the stallion as collateral for yet another loan extension. "Once I get him trained and ready for breeding, he'll solve all my financial problems." But standing here now, watching Thunder respond to Jake's patient approach with a willingness he had never shown to Marcus or any of the expensive trainers, Marcus began to understand that his approach to the horse had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. He had seen Thunder as a commodity to be exploited rather than a living being to be understood, a source of income rather than a creature worthy of respect in his own right. Thunder stretched his neck forward, his muzzle now mere inches from Jake's outstretched palm. The stallion's nostrils flared as he took in Jake's scent one final time, processing the complex chemical information that would inform his ultimate decision about trust. What he found there must have satisfied his deepest concerns, because slowly, deliberately, with the gravity of a creature making a choice that violated every survival instinct he had developed over 5 years of careful isolation, Thunder lowered his head and touched his velvet muzzle to Jake's waiting hand. The contact lasted only a second, barely long enough for the watching crowd to register what had happened. But in that brief moment of connection, something fundamental shifted in the universe of possibilities that existed between human and horse. Thunder immediately pulled back, not in fear or rejection, but in the cautious manner of a creature testing the safety of a new experience before committing to it fully. "Jesus Christ," Carlos whispered, crossing himself again as he witnessed what everyone had declared impossible. He actually touched him. Jake felt the electric thrill of contact race up his arm and settle in his chest like a prayer answered. Thunder's muzzle had been warm and soft, carrying the sweet scent of grass and hay. And in that brief touch, Jake had felt the tremor of muscles held in careful control. The physical manifestation of a will that was choosing trust over survival instinct. "Easy, son," Jake murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You did good. You did real good." Sarah felt tears she didn't expect stinging her eyes as she witnessed the breakthrough she had dreamed of for 5 years, but never believed possible. All her textbooks and research papers had described this moment in clinical terms. But seeing it happen in real time was something altogether different, a testament to the healing power of patience and the fundamental resilience of creatures that refuse to surrender their capacity for connection despite overwhelming evidence that such trust was dangerous. Pete removed his hat and ran weathered fingers through his grey hair, his own emotions complicated by the realization that he had been working alongside Thunder for 5 years without ever truly seeing him. Always figured that horse was too damaged to save, he admitted. Reckon I was looking at him all wrong. Thunder stood perfectly still for several long moments, processing the revolutionary experience of human touch that brought comfort rather than pain. His dark eyes remained fixed on Jake's face, reading the calm satisfaction there, the absence of triumph or dominance, the quiet respect that acknowledged what Thunder had given up by choosing to trust. Then, in a gesture that stunned everyone watching, Thunder stepped forward again and deliberately placed his muzzle against Jake's palm, this time holding the contact for several heartbeats before pulling away. It was not submission but partnership, not surrender but collaboration. The beginning of a conversation that had been waiting 5 years to begin. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest as he watched this impossible communion unfold before him, a fissure in the carefully constructed walls of his own pride that let in the first light of humility he had experienced in years. The horse he had owned but never known was revealing depths of character and capacity that Marcus had never imagined, responding to qualities in this stranger that Marcus wasn't sure he possessed himself. Deep in Jake's saddlebag, wrapped in an oiled cloth that had protected it through 3 deployments and countless miles of wandering, lay a Congressional Medal of Honor that he had never displayed, never mentioned, and never used to define his worth. The medal bore the inscription for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. But Jake had learned long ago that true heroism was rarely about dramatic gestures and more often about quiet acts of service that no one would ever celebrate. Thunder continued to explore this new reality of human contact, approaching Jake's hand again and again with growing confidence. Each touch lasted a little longer. Each connection carried a little less tension as the stallion gradually updated his understanding of what human hands could mean. Where once they had brought only pain and restraint, Jake's hands offered nothing more threatening than patient stillness and respectful acknowledgement. "Look at his whole body," Sarah said, her veterinary training helping her read the significance of Thunder's transformation. "His muscle tension has completely changed. 5 minutes ago, every fiber was coiled for flight or fight. Now he's actually relaxed." Jake could feel the shift, too, the way Thunder's energy had transformed from the brittle hypervigilance of trauma to something approaching natural equine curiosity. The stallion's breathing had deepened further. His stance had widened into something stable rather than defensive. And most remarkably, he had begun to show interest in Jake as an individual rather than simply monitoring him as a potential threat. "In Afghanistan," Jake said, allowing Thunder to investigate his sleeve with gentle nudges, "I worked with a horse named Desert Storm, who had been caught in an IED explosion. Physically he was fine, but psychologically he was shattered. Couldn't stand the sound of helicopters, would panic at unexpected noises, refused to let anyone touch his legs where he'd been injured." Thunder's ears pricked forward at the sound of Jake's voice, drawn by the calm rhythm and the underlying tone of understanding that seemed to speak directly to his traumatized nervous system. The stallion began to explore Jake's clothing more boldly, using his sensitive muzzle to investigate textures and scents while maintaining the respectful distance that Jake's body language continued to communicate. It took 6 months of daily work before Desert Storm would let me put a halter on him, Jake continued. Not because he couldn't learn, but because he needed time to understand that the halter represented partnership rather than domination. The breakthrough came when I stopped trying to train him and started trying to understand him. Marcus found himself thinking about his father's words from years past, advice he had dismissed as outdated wisdom from a simpler time. "Son," Robert Sterling had said during Marcus's rebellious teenage years, "there's a difference between owning something and earning it. You can buy a horse, but you can't buy his respect. That has to be earned through character." The irony was not lost on Marcus, that his father's words were being demonstrated by a homeless drifter, while he, the legitimate heir to the Sterling legacy, stood watching from behind a fence like a stranger to his own property. Everything about this situation challenged his fundamental assumptions about power, ownership, and what it meant to be worthy of respect. Thunder had begun to show signs of genuine affection, resting his great head near Jake's shoulder and allowing his eyes to half close in the manner of a horse that felt truly safe for the first time in years. The transformation was so complete, so contrary to everything everyone had witnessed over the past 5 years, that it seemed like they were looking at an entirely different animal. "He's not the same horse," Pete said, his voice filled with wonder. "It's like watching someone wake up from a bad dream." Jake reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew the unused halter that had hung on Thunder's post for 5 years. Its leather supple from careful maintenance, but unmarked by use. The sight of it had always sent Thunder into frantic retreat, but now the stallion showed only mild interest, sniffing the leather with curious rather than fearful attention. "The halter was never the problem," Jake said, holding the leather straps where Thunder could see and smell them clearly. "The problem was the relationship between the horse and the person holding it. When trust exists, equipment becomes just equipment. When trust is absent, even the gentlest tools become instruments of oppression." With movements so slow they seemed suspended in time, Jake lifted the halter toward Thunder's head. The stallion watched with alert but calm attention, his body language communicating acceptance rather than the explosive rejection that had characterized every previous attempt. And then, in a moment that redefined everything everyone thought they knew about the impossible, Thunder lowered his head and allowed Jake Morrison to slip the halter over his ears and buckle it gently beneath his jaw, accepting for the first time in 5 years the symbol of partnership between horse and human. The foreclosure, notice in Marcus's desk drawer, seemed to burn, like a guilty secret, as he watched Jake accomplish in 2 hours what Marcus had failed to achieve in 5 years of ownership. The document, emblazoned with the seal of Wyoming First National Bank, gave him 30 days to bring his loan current or face the loss of everything his family had built over 4 generations. The ranch, the cattle, the outbuildings, even Thunder himself would be sold at auction to satisfy the debts that Marcus's pride had prevented him from addressing honestly. Sarah felt her world shift as she realized the full implications of what she was witnessing. Her online research had finally yielded results, revealing Jake Morrison's military service record through a veterans database that documented his 3 tours in Afghanistan, his work with the military's animal therapy program, and most remarkably, his Congressional Medal of Honor for actions that had saved the lives of 12 fellow soldiers and 23 horses during a Taliban attack on a forward operating base. "Dad," Sarah said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of discovery, "do you know who this man is?" But Marcus was beyond caring about Jake's credentials, watching instead as his most valuable asset responded to a homeless drifter with the kind of trust and cooperation that represented millions of dollars in breeding potential. Thunder stood calmly beside Jake, the halter resting easily on his head. His entire demeanor transformed from wild isolation to willing partnership. "Impossible," Marcus breathed, his worldview crumbling as he faced the evidence of his own inadequacy. That horse has never let anyone put a halter on him. 3 professional trainers, 2 veterinarians, and a dozen ranch hands have all tried and failed. Jake ran his hand gently along Thunder's neck, feeling the powerful muscles relax under his touch. The stallion's skin was warm and slightly damp, with the honest sweat of emotional breakthrough rather than the cold perspiration of fear. Thunder's breathing remained deep and steady, his eyes bright with an alertness that spoke of engagement rather than hypervigilance. "The difference," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of hard-won experience, "is that everyone else was trying to break his will. I was trying to understand his heart." Pete removed his hat and held it against his chest, a gesture of respect that he hadn't made since his own father's funeral. "In 30 years of working with livestock," he said, "I've never seen anything like this. That horse was as close to broken as any animal I've ever encountered. And here he is, acting like he's been gentled from birth." Thunder began to explore his new reality, testing the feel of the halter with gentle movements of his head. Where once such restraint would have triggered explosive panic, now it seemed to provide a kind of security, a tangible connection to the human who had proven himself worthy of trust. The stallion's ears remained forward, his attention focused on Jake with the kind of devoted concentration that spoke of genuine partnership. The ranch hands gathered closer to the fence, drawn by the magnetism of witnessing something unprecedented. Carlos crossed himself again, murmuring a prayer of gratitude for miracles. Henry, despite his arthritis, gripped the fence rail and leaned forward to see every detail of Thunder's transformation. Even the cattle in distant pastures seemed to sense that something extraordinary was happening, their own restless energy calming in response to the peace that radiated from the corral. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her question directed as much to the universe as to Jake himself. Jake looked at Thunder, then at the assembled crowd, his expression thoughtful as he considered the implications of what they had accomplished together. The bet that had started this encounter seemed insignificant now, overshadowed by the larger questions of what healing looked like and what responsibilities came with the gift of trust. "Now," Jake said, his hand still resting on Thunder's neck, "we have to decide what we're going to do with this miracle." Marcus felt the weight of his father's championship trophy pressing down on him like a physical burden, its inscription about character versus possessions taking on new meaning as he watched Jake demonstrate the very qualities that Marcus had spent his entire life trying to purchase rather than develop. The ranch that he was about to lose through poor decisions and prideful stubbornness was being transformed before his eyes by a man who owned nothing but understood everything. Thunder lifted his head and nickered softly, a sound that none of the ranch hands had ever heard him make. It was the voice of a horse who remembered what it felt like to trust, who had found his way back to the fundamental connection between his species and humanity that trauma had stolen from him. In that gentle sound was the promise of healing, not just for Thunder, but for everyone who had the wisdom to learn from his example. Jake reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a worn manila folder containing his military discharge papers, the official documentation of his honorable separation from active duty, with commendations for his work developing trauma therapy protocols for both human and animal veterans. The papers bore the signatures of commanding officers who had witnessed firsthand Jake's ability to heal creatures that other experts had written off as beyond help. "The bet's won," Jake said simply, his hand still resting on Thunder's neck. "According to our agreement, this ranch now belongs to me." The words fell into the evening air like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief that spread through the gathered crowd. Marcus felt his knees weaken as the reality of his situation crystallized with brutal clarity. He had gambled everything on an impossibility, and now that impossibility had become reality, taking with it not just his pride, but his entire legacy. "But," Jake continued, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man accustomed to making decisions that affected lives, "I have a different proposition." Sarah stepped forward, her discharge papers from Jake's military service visible in the folder he held. "Jake Morrison," she read aloud, "a recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, Purple Heart, and Bronze Star, specialist in equine trauma therapy and veteran rehabilitation programs. She looked up at her father with eyes that held both sadness and hope. "Dad, do you understand what this means?" Marcus struggled to process the information, his carefully constructed world of assumptions and prejudices collapsing around him like a house built on sand. This homeless drifter wasn't just a wanderer looking for handouts. He was a decorated war hero whose understanding of trauma and healing far exceeded anything Marcus had ever encountered. "I don't want your ranch," Jake said, his words cutting through Marcus's confusion with gentle firmness. "What I want is to help you save it." The proposal that followed would transform not just the Sterling Ranch, but the entire community's understanding of what healing looked like when approached with wisdom rather than force. Jake outlined his vision of converting the struggling cattle operation into a therapeutic facility where veterans and traumatized animals could heal together, creating a sustainable model that would honor both the land's agricultural heritage and its potential for serving those who had sacrificed for others. Trauma therapy centers are desperately needed, Jake explained, his hand never leaving Thunder's calm presence. The military has programs for human veterans, and there are scattered facilities for animals, but very few places that understand how healing one helps heal the other. Thunder stood perfectly still as Jake spoke, his presence serving as living proof of the concepts being discussed. The stallion's transformation from wild isolation to trusting partnership demonstrated more convincingly than any academic. Study the power of trauma-informed therapy when applied with patience and genuine understanding. Marcus felt something fundamental shifting inside him as he began to understand the magnitude of what Jake was offering. Instead of losing everything through his own pride and poor decisions, he was being given an opportunity to transform his legacy into something far more meaningful than a simple cattle ranch. "You would do that?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Help me save the ranch even though I tried to humiliate you?" Jake's response carried the weight of hard-won wisdom and the understanding that healing often required offering grace to those who had caused harm. Hurt people," he said simply. "But healed people can help heal people. That's what Thunder just taught us." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she realized the scope of the transformation being offered. Her veterinary studies had prepared her for many things, but not for witnessing the kind of practical application of healing principles that could change entire communities. The ranch that had been her childhood home could become a beacon of hope for others who had experienced trauma and loss. Pete and the other ranch hands exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their understanding of what this moment meant. Instead of facing unemployment and the dissolution of a community they had helped build, they were being offered the chance to participate in something unprecedented, a working ranch that would demonstrate how agriculture and therapy could work together to heal both land and lives. Thunder nickered again, the sound carrying across the corral like a benediction, as if the stallion understood that his personal breakthrough was just the beginning of something much larger than any of them had imagined possible. Marcus reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out his father's worn work gloves, leather softened by decades of honest labor that told a different story than the pristine appearance Marcus had cultivated in recent years. Robert Sterling had worn these gloves while building the ranch from nothing, through seasons of drought and abundance, through the kind of challenges that revealed character rather than concealing it behind expensive equipment and hired help. "My father would have known what to do," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion as he held the gloves that represented everything he had tried to avoid becoming. "He would have seen what you saw in Thunder, would have understood what I've been doing wrong all these years." Jake watched Marcus with the same patient attention he had given Thunder, recognizing in the man's struggle the familiar signs of someone confronting the gap between who they thought they were and who they had actually become. Pride was often the hardest prison to escape, particularly when it had been built from fear and maintained through willful blindness to one's own limitations. "Your father's legacy isn't about the past," Jake said gently. "It's about what you choose to do right now, in this moment. With the understanding you have today." Thunder seemed to sense the emotional weight of the conversation, stepping closer to Jake and resting his great head against the man's shoulder in a gesture of comfort that spoke to the depth of trust they had established. The stallion's presence served as a living reminder that transformation was possible, that even the most damaged relationships could be healed when approached with genuine respect and understanding. Sarah moved to stand beside her father, her own hands reaching out to touch the gloves that represented the grandfather she had never known, but whose values had shaped her understanding of what it meant to work with animals. "Grandpa would be proud of what we're about to build here," she said softly. This is exactly the kind of thing he would have supported. The sun had now set completely, painting the sky in deep purples and indigos that made the corral feel like a sacred space where miracles had become ordinary occurrences. Battery-powered lanterns cast pools of warm light that illuminated the faces of people whose lives had been fundamentally altered by witnessing what happened when patience and understanding replaced force and dominance. Jake began to outline the practical steps needed to transform the Sterling Ranch into a therapeutic facility, his military background evident in the methodical way he approached complex problems. The existing infrastructure could be adapted to serve both traditional ranching operations and therapeutic programs, creating a sustainable model that would honor the land's agricultural heritage while serving a desperate need in the veteran and animal rescue communities. "Thunder will be our lead therapy horse," Jake explained, his hand never leaving the stallion's neck. "His story of overcoming trauma will inspire other veterans and help them understand that healing is possible even after the worst experiences." Marcus felt something fundamental shifting inside him as he listened to Jake's vision, recognizing for the first time in years the possibility of building something meaningful rather than simply maintaining appearances. The foreclosure notice that had terrified him for weeks now seemed less like a death sentence and more like an opportunity to choose a different path. "What would you need from me?" Marcus asked, his question carrying the weight of genuine humility rather than the defensive pride that had characterized most of his adult interactions. Jake's response revealed the depth of his understanding about both trauma recovery and sustainable community building. The transformation would require Marcus to learn new skills, to acknowledge his limitations, and most importantly, to approach both animals and people with the kind of respect that Jake had demonstrated with Thunder. Thunder stood calmly beside them as plans took shape around him, his presence serving as proof that even the most impossible transformations could become reality when approached with wisdom, patience, and genuine care. The stallion, who had spent 5 years in isolation, had become the cornerstone of a vision that could heal not just individual lives, but an entire community's understanding of what strength really meant. Pete and the other ranch hands listened with growing excitement as they realized that their jobs weren't ending but evolving, that their decades of experience with livestock would become valuable assets in helping traumatized veterans learn to trust again through working with animals who understood their pain. Jake reached into his saddlebag one final time and withdrew a small wooden horse, intricately carved from a piece of cedar he had found in the mountains of Afghanistan. The carving was a gift he had been carrying for 3 years, waiting for the right person to receive it, someone who would understand its significance as a symbol of patience, healing, and the kind of love that could transform even the most damaged relationships. "This is for you," Jake said, placing the wooden horse in Sarah's hands, "for understanding what Thunder needed and for having the courage to support what needed to happen here today." Sarah cradled the carving with reverence, feeling the smooth wood that had been shaped by hands that understood both creation and healing. The tiny horse seemed to capture something essential about Thunder's spirit, the nobility that had survived beneath years of defensive anger, the capacity for trust that had been waiting for someone worthy to claim it. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she realized the full magnitude of what this day had brought into their lives. "Thank you." Marcus stepped forward, his father's work glove still clutched in his hands like a talisman of transformation. "Teach me," he said simply, his words carrying the weight of complete surrender to a wisdom he had spent years resisting. "Teach me how to do what you did with Thunder." The request represented more than just wanting to learn horse training techniques. It was an admission that everything Marcus thought he knew about leadership, ownership and strength had been fundamentally flawed. He was asking to be rebuilt from the ground up, to learn what his father had tried to teach him through example, but which pride had prevented him from accepting. Jake studied Marcus with the same careful attention he had given Thunder, reading the signs of genuine readiness for change. Like the stallion, Marcus had reached a point where his defensive strategies were no longer sustainable, where the choice was between transformation or destruction. "The first lesson," Jake said, "is learning to approach Thunder not as someone who owns him, but as someone who hopes to earn his friendship. That means putting aside everything you think you know about control and dominance." Thunder watched this human interaction with the keen intelligence that had always been hidden beneath his traumatized behavior. The stallion seemed to understand that Marcus represented a different kind of challenge than Jake had, not the patient healing of wounds, but the more complex task of teaching someone to unlearn harmful patterns and replace them with healthier ones. Over the following weeks, the transformation of both Marcus and the ranch began in earnest. Jake moved into the foreman's quarters, his few possessions serving as a reminder that wealth had nothing to do with accumulation and everything to do with the richness of one's relationships and the depth of one's purpose. Marcus's first lesson with Thunder was a humbling experience that required him to approach the stallion with the kind of vulnerability he had spent his entire adult life avoiding. Under Jake's patient guidance, Marcus learned to read Thunder's body language, to respect the horse's boundaries, and most importantly, to earn trust through consistency rather than demanding submission through force. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later when Thunder finally allowed Marcus to touch his muzzle, a moment that represented not just progress in animal training, but a fundamental shift in Marcus's understanding of what real strength looked like. The man who had tried to control everything through money and authority discovered that genuine power came from service, from earning trust rather than commanding obedience. Sarah threw herself into the planning for the therapeutic ranch with the passion of someone who had finally found her true calling. Her veterinary studies took on new meaning as she researched trauma-informed care protocols and began designing programs that would serve both human and animal clients. The silver feeding bowl that had once symbolized Thunder's rejection of human care was cleaned and polished, ready to serve its intended purpose when Thunder decided he was ready to accept food from human hands. The ranch hands found themselves learning alongside Marcus, their traditional skills enhanced by Jake's insights into animal psychology and trauma recovery. Pete discovered that his 3 decades of experience with livestock had given him an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that translated beautifully into therapeutic work. Carlos's gentle nature made him a natural assistant in helping anxious animals learn to trust again. As autumn settled over the Wyoming landscape, the Sterling Ranch bore little resemblance to the struggling cattle operation that had been facing foreclosure just months before. The transformation was evident not just in the improved facilities and new purpose, but in the faces of everyone who lived and worked there, a community that had discovered what happened when healing became the central mission rather than mere survival or profit. A new sign now stood at the entrance to the ranch. its carved wooden letters weathered to blend naturally with the landscape while announcing a mission that would have seemed impossible just months before. Sterling Therapeutic Ranch, where healing begins. The sign had been crafted by a veteran woodworker from the first group of clients, a Marine who had lost his left arm in Iraq and discovered through working with Thunder that disability didn't define limitation, adaptation did. Thunder himself had become something of a legend in the therapeutic community. His story spreading through word of mouth among veterans organizations and animal rescue networks. The stallion, who had once been considered beyond help, now served as the lead therapy horse, his calm presence and intuitive understanding of human trauma making him uniquely qualified to help others heal. On this particular morning, Thunder stood in the center of the main corral, wearing his halter with the dignity of a creature who had chosen partnership over isolation. Beside him, Marcus Sterling demonstrated the grooming techniques that had taken him 3 months to master, his movements patient and respectful as he worked to maintain the trust that Thunder had gradually extended to him. "Remember," Marcus said to the small group of veterans watching his demonstration, "it's not about controlling the horse. It's about communication, about earning the right to be in his space and contributing to his well-being." The transformation in Marcus was perhaps even more remarkable than Thunder's breakthrough. The man who had once measured worth through possessions and dominance had learned to find meaning in service and humility. His father's work gloves had become his most prized possessions, and worn daily as a reminder that true wealth came from honest labor and genuine relationships. Jake watched from the fence rail, his role having evolved from teacher to partner as the therapeutic ranch grew beyond what any of them had originally envisioned. Veterans came from across the country to participate in programs that paired them with horses who understood trauma, and the waiting list for admission had grown to over 6 months. Sarah had completed her veterinary degree early. Her research on trauma-informed equine therapy earning recognition from universities and treatment centers worldwide. Her relationship with Jake had deepened naturally through their shared work, built on mutual respect and a common understanding of what healing required from those called to facilitate it. The ranch now hosted 30 horses, each one rescued from various forms of trauma and rehabilitated using the methods that Jake had pioneered with Thunder. The original silver feeding bowl had become a ceremonial item, used only for special occasions. When a horse reached the milestone of accepting food directly from human hands, a moment that represented the ultimate victory of trust over fear. Thunder's greatest achievement, however, was not his own healing, but his uncanny ability to help other traumatized animals learn to trust again. Veterans who worked with Thunder often described a sense of recognition in the stallion's eyes, as if he understood their pain in ways that humans could not. The horse had become a bridge between species, demonstrating that healing was a universal language that transcended the boundaries between human and animal experience. The morning session included 3 new veterans: a Navy corpsman struggling with survivor's guilt, an Army sergeant dealing with the aftermath of an IED explosion, and an Air Force pilot whose helicopter crash had left him with both physical and psychological scars. Each man approached Thunder with the wariness of someone who had learned to expect betrayal from a world that had promised safety but delivered violence. But Thunder met each approach with the patient wisdom of a creature who had traveled the same journey from trauma to healing. His presence seemed to communicate a message that no amount of words could convey, that survival was possible, that trust could be rebuilt, and that the capacity for connection survived even the worst experiences. Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion as he watched Thunder work with the newest arrivals, recognizing in the horse's gentle persistence the same qualities that Jake had brought to their first encounter months ago. The stallion had learned not just to accept human care, but to offer healing in return. becoming a teacher whose lessons carried the authority of lived experience. The foreclosure notice that had once threatened to destroy everything now sat framed in Marcus's office, transformed from a source of shame into a reminder of how close he had come to losing something infinitely more valuable than land or money. Beside it hung his father's championship trophy, its inscription about character versus possessions taking on new meaning in the context of everything they had built together. As the sun reached its zenith over the Wyoming landscape, casting sharp shadows across the corrals where healing happened one relationship at a time, Thunder lifted his head and nickered softly, the sound of a creature who had found his purpose and was sharing it generously with anyone wise enough to listen.